So I just want to, we did finish one of the paragraphs last week, so let's just quickly go over what we learned. Number one, we learned a medrash about Ruvain, Aaron, and Boaz. And I'll just mention it, I'll stress it a little bit. I believe that medrash, Rabbi Yaakov's interpretation of that medrash was influenced by Slobodki Yeshiva, that, every man had godless ha'adam, every person can create like HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that medrash basically says that when we do an action, it can have tremendous ramifications, which is a Slabotka idea, even Kol Ma'asecha v'Chol Ma'asecha b'Sefer Nichtavim, to learn it as not as Sifrei Tzadikim Rishayim, but to learn it as what you do counts. That's a very Slabotka idea, Don't sin because what you could do is so great. That was the first thing. The second thing was a piece of chinuch by Reb Yaakov, but we didn't come back to, and Michael Citra mentioned this last week, and then he wrote me about it. We didn't come back to how Reb Yaakov learns up the text exactly. That was about the story about Ruth, which was Reb Yaakov focused his idea on the story of Ruth, and his question was, why was Ruth influenced to continue on her journey with Naomi, and why wasn't Orpah convinced to continue on her journey? Okay, Reb Yaakov says there's two types of two ways of being mechanech. One way is through teaching actively, being mechanech somebody else, and the other way is passively, by being a model for somebody, but not actually teaching the person, but rather the person seeing that model. I mentioned last week Rav Soloveitchik's story about Rav Kook, and we didn't talk about it, but maybe you saw it. I photocopied a piece of Rav Soloveitchik on his hesped, on his mechateneste, the Tolen Rebbe's wife, and there he talks about, he says people think there's only one Masorah in Judaism. There's two. There's the father's Masorah, Shma b'di Musar Avicha, and there's the mother's Masorah, Val titosh Torah zimecha. And Rav Soloveitchik claims that the mother's Masorah is twofold. One is that it's there to teach me the spirit of the law instead of just the letter of the law. He says, I learned from my father the letter of the law, what I should do, what I shouldn't do, how I should act, I should not act, right? But I learned from my mother the spirit of the law. In other words, Hilchas Shabbos I learned from my father, but the beauty of Shabbos I learned from my mother. How did I learn that from my mother? That's his second yesod. Is not she only taught him, not only she teach him the spirit of the law, how to enjoy Shabbos, but she did it in a passive way by him watching her. That's what he writes over there. So Rav Soloveitchik understands this yesod as part of his mother's Masorah. Reb Yaakov understands that as two ways of being mechanech a person. And Reb Yaakov held that the better way, in many of the cases, to be mechanech somebody is through modeling rather than teaching. Don't do as I say, do as I do, right? Because a lot of times we have people who say a lot, they don't really, what they do doesn't really match what they say. But if you're a model, then obviously the person looks at you and sees you're a model for something, and that way you're teaching somebody, but you're not ramming it down their throat, right? So Reb Yaakov goes on to say, and let's see the last paragraph. That's I gave you on page 3 of last week, Shin Samach Gimel. So Reb Yaakov spoke about the two types of chinuch, and then he says, Kain haya benomi shenomi rak ne noaga atzmo bedas Yehudis v'astab beisa beis Yehudi. And Nomi was Noeg herself, right? She lived her life with Das Yehudis, and she made a home that was a base Yehudi. They saw her ways. So we see the tremendous koch hashpa. Now, how does Reb Yaakov know this? That Nomi used the this approach to chinuch and not the approach of libud. He's going to soon say, "Shal yedei hanhogas Nomi hushpa rus v'dofka bo umimenu yotza hamelach hamashiach." Through this method that Nomi used of hashpa, which is the passive method, she being a model, Ruth was mushpa, and she clung to her, as the text says. Now, Rabbi Yaakov doesn't stop on this, but we can take up from that is Mashiach was born out of this method and not the other method. Mashiach was born out of the passive method of hashpa'ah, meaning seeing a model, rather than Mashiach being born out of the limud, which tells you again, Rabbi Yaakov doesn't say this, but what you could see is that hashpah is so great that Melech HaMashiach was born through that method of chinuch and not the other method of chinuch. Mashen kein arpa lo ushpa v'lo lamda mimena. Arpa was not mushpa and didn't learn from her. I can't say that Rabbi Yaakov means she didn't learn anything. She wasn't mushpa at all, because at the beginning she does want to go along, but at the end of the day, it didn't have the whole effect on her that it had on Ruth. So Ruth was more mushpat than Nomi. V'lachein nevdu kol kochateha. Then all her kochos that she had, all her potential, was lost. Ume'anhagasa shel Nomi lomdim Chazal. From the anhagasa of Nomi, Chazal learned Dinei Geirus. The Gemara in Yevamos learns the Dinei of Geirus. The Adarab lo havi mitzvah l'karev otam, because according to Chazal, there's no mitzvah to be makarev a non-Jew. In fact, it's not in the Gemara, but there's a medrash that says you have to send the potential ger away 3 times, based on a pasuk in psukim in Ruth, because she says lechno shovna 3 times, so she sends them away. Lechno shovna. Go and return, right? 3 times. So the Medrash says, but it's not a Gemara. Interestingly enough, we're knowing like this Medrash, but it's not the Gemara Yevamos doesn't say it at all. It's not brought. I don't think it's even brought in Shulchan Aruch. Okay, but somehow or another it became a minhag of the Bezdin to send people away. But the Gemara does learn that all the things that Ruth said, Amech Ame, Elokayach Elokai, right? Besher Tomusi Amos, right? Those are all answers to questions that Nomi raised to Ruth. The Gemara says, like, by us you can't serve avodah zara, Elokayach Elokai. Our nation is a problematic nation. They don't like them. Amechami, right? Now, the Gemara does learn, like Reb Yaakov says, but the Gemara makes it pretty clear that she's trying to push her away. Okay, so what is Reb Yaakov saying over here? Reb Yaakov saying you can't learn that she was malamed them, because in Hilchas Geirus there's no limud, because you don't want to encourage the person. Only when you know that the person is convinced do you start teaching them. But at the beginning you don't want to encourage them. So obviously when they were living with her, she wasn't trying to encourage them, because she didn't get an impression necessarily from them that they want to become Giorisin. So she didn't necessarily do something active. So that Reb Yaakov says, the Adarabba, lo avi mitzvah karvatim, rak tzrichem laso sheyeh kosha aleim lizkar. You have to actually make it more difficult. Elisha shpa shesaf garus minami govra al kol ma shehikshasa aleha. So you have to say that she got it through hashpah, because that you're allowed to show a non-Jew how you live a Jewish life. You're not because you have to live a proper Jewish life. That you can even make a Kiddush Hashem that way. right? But you're not supposed to actually teach them until you're actually convinced that they want to be Jewish. So that's what Reb Yaakov is basically saying is there's a difference between limud and hashpah. The limud has to do, and this is really the question that the question is really like, okay, so why did it work for Ruth, and why didn't it work for Orpah? So Rabbi Yosef in Ha'ara 9 sort of says it in a lumdish way, right? One is active, I said, and one is passive, right? But really, one is totally in the Melamed. The first way when I teach you, it's totally how charismatic the teacher is, and the other one is really totally in the student, because you're not doing anything. All you're doing is being a model. So now it depends if the student, right? So Rabbi Yosef says, Zekvar totally b'taharas leiv shalom makabel. One's totally in the no saying, and one's totally in the makabel. So if somebody is teaching somebody, right? So if he's charismatic, he can convince you of anything. That's why they always hire for kiruv the most charismatic guys. Not necessarily because they're the biggest Talmidei Chachamim, but because they're very charismatic. So they're gonna be mashpia by teaching you, by answering your questions, so to speak. They know how to answer the questions. They know they're charismatic, so you really get impressed by them. That's the first way of chinuch, which is basically through limud, right? But the second way has to do with the makabel already. So Ruth was makabel from Nomi. She, saw Nomi as a model, and therefore she went after her, a total model. Whereas Orpah, that's totally in Orpah. These are two different personalities. In other words, Nomi was the same person, right? But one saw Nomi way X and one saw Nomi way Y. And they both saw Nomi as positive, but one was more mushpah than the other because that has to do with the personality of the makabel. That's the way. That's the way I think Reb Yaakov is understanding this idea why Ruth went along and why Nomi didn't, because it was a question of hashpah. Because it couldn't be a question of limud, because on a non-Jew you can't be melamed. By the way, I mentioned there's a machlokus rishonim on whether or not they were megayer before they married them. So from Chazal, it looks pretty clear, Masechta Yevamos, that they were not megayer before they married them, and that makes sense because where would they get a bezdin from? And that's the way Reb Yaakov was learning as well, and that's the way Rashi learns. If you look, Rashi learns that way too. The Ibn Ezra doesn't learn that way, and he tries to fetch rayas for it, but you have to take a look at the Ibn Ezra and say for Ruth. Okay, that's this. Okay, let's go on to the thing I want to do today. So I want to give you a little bit of introduction today of what I'm picking, the first piece in Sefer Yoshua. This piece, by the way, Reb Yaakov sort of wrote out in different places, bits and pieces, but there's one place where he wrote a letter to someone who wanted to publish a sefer, and that's where I gave Reb Yosef this piece, which was a sort of a michtav or a haskama on a sefer, okay? And he writes over here, the number 1, right, that's on page Lamed Hey, that's the first piece of Yoshua. Hutuk mitoch sefer hesped, divrei hesped shel Rabbeinu al yididnu Rab Yeshivas Lomja, Reb Moshe something, Moshe Yosher. I don't remember he had 2 names. And I don't think it's Moshe Mordechai Yosher. Maybe it is. I don't remember. Shemosel etfus b'sefer Ramban kitchoker mekubal. There was a person by the name of Rav Dr. Chaim Chanoch. He was the son-in-law of Rav Yosher. You guys should know who Rav Yosher is. Rav Yosher was the person who wrote the famous work on the Chafetz Chaim. He was a Talmud of the Chafetz Chaim, and he wrote in Hebrew this the biography of Chafetz Chaim, which was translated by ArtScroll into English in 2 volumes. Right? If I'm not mistaken, they didn't show you a picture of the author. It could be they didn't show you the picture of the author because he only had a Van Dyke. He was a rabbi in New York, but he only had a Van Dyke. He didn't have a full beard, so I'm not. Maybe art school was a little bit nervous about printing his picture somewhere. But I knew him very well, and he lived in Katamon. He made Aliyah, lived in Katamon, and he had a son-in-law named Harav Dr. Chaim Chanoch, and in the beginning, he asks Reb Yaakov, his father-in-law, Dr. Chanoch's father-in-law, who's Rav Yosher, asks Reb Yaakov to write a letter on the Sefer. Okay, and Reb Yaakov always used writing a letter as an excuse to write a Dvar Torah. That's what a lot of times he did. So he decided to write his Dvar Torah that he has on a certain medrash that fits with the doctor's father-in-law, Rav Yosher, who was, by the way, a friend of my grandfather, I think from Yeshivas Lomja. He learned by Chavetz Chaim in Radin, but he also learned Lomja Yeshiva in Lomja. So this is the piece, and part of the piece we're going to see in a footnote as well. And then Rabbi Yosef also was going to go on to bring you another piece that connects with this piece. We're not going to do that right now. We'll just do the piece that Reb Yaakov himself wrote. Okay, and he starts off with a very interesting medrash. Garsinam b'tmura. Okay, that's page Lamed Hey, the first pasuk. Vayacharei Moshe Eved Hashem Vayom Hashem El Yoshua Mishareis Moshe Lema. Garsinam b'tmura. Says in Tmura b'shash nifter Moshe Rabbeinu legan Eden Amalo Yoshua Sha'al Mimenu Kol Sveika Sheyesh B'cha. When Moshe Rabbeinu was getting ready to leave and go to Gan Eden, he said to Yeshua, ask for me all the doubts that you have. Amalo, Rebbe, klumi nachticha sha'achas. Rebbe, did I leave you even for 1 minute? And I went like for a smoke, or I went out to get a cup of a nice cafe or something, right? You didn't write about me? You wrote about me in the Torah that I was servant. I didn't move, right? I didn't move from the midst of the tent where you taught. I never left the tent. Miyad toshash kocho shel Yoshua v'nishtakchu mimenu v'nishtakchu mimenu shlosh me'od halachos v'chule. The strength of Yoshua came weak, and he forgot. It was forgotten from him 300 halachos. For Amdu Kol Yisrael lahargo, and all of Israel wanted to kill him, which is very interesting in itself. Rabbi Yaakov doesn't really go into that. So God said to him, I can't tell you, which of course implies that Yeshua went to ask God about the 300 halachos that he forgot. I can't tell you. Lech v'torda b'milchama. Right? And God says to Yoshua, right, that he should prepare them for war. Right? Why does it say right away he should prepare for war? Because he should get them, he should distract the Jewish people so they won't get too nervous about the fact that he forgot 300 halachas. Upirish Rashi says, "V'nishtakhu mimenu miYoshua v'avon shegor lachlish daito shel Moshe," and Rashi learns that because he lost the 300 halachas because of he caused Moshe to be weakened. Shenitztar Moshe al Yoshua ba'atzmo. Now there's something missing here. It doesn't make any sense. Shenitztar Moshe al Yoshua shenishtabech ba'atzmo shohaya godel kamoso. The Shita Mikubetzis at the side of Masechta Tmura on that daf says shenishtabech ba'atzmo. He praised himself, Yoshua, that he was godel kamoso, that he was great as Moshe. There were Yoshua wasn't a Balgaiva, but he had simanim that he was as great as Moshe. It doesn't say in this Gemara what the simanim were, but what is Reb Yaakov explained this orally at a different point, that he had reasons to think that he was as similar as Moshe because, for instance, he wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah after Moshe died. according to one sheet in the Gemara and Baba Basra, he wrote the last 8 psukim. That means he also wrote Torah. Okay, it was the last 8 psukim, but it's part of the Torah, right? So Rashi understands that Moshe became weakened because of the fact that Yoshua thought himself like Moshe. So what does this medrash mean? It's a very strange medrash. Why was Moshe so makpid on Yoshua over here, right? That he didn't say to him, that he didn't ask him. Moshe said, "Do you have any questions?" And Yeshua said, "Why should I have any questions? I never missed a shiur," right? Shlohikpid al Miriam shiktina erech nevuaso. He wasn't makpid on Miriam that lessened Moshe's nevuah, right? What does Miriam say? He spoke to us too. We're also Nevi'im like Moshe, right? Moshe wasn't makpid on that, even though we know that Moshe was actually different as God comes and tells them. But Ish Moshe Anav Ma'od, it says over there in Baloscha. The Kan Lechora Hu Atzedik Hatzedek Haya Im Yoshua. Lechora, Yoshua is right over here because he says, "I never left your tent. Why should I forget? Why should I have a question?" Right? It doesn't say why should I forget, but why should I have a question? In Miriam v'Aaron b'nei Dorim shel Moshe shonim Yoshua shekfar dor acharei Moshe is b'nei Aaron and Moshe. Is Aaron and Miriam the part of the generation of Moshe different than Yoshua is already a different generation? Why is he makpid on Yoshua and Yoshua forgets halachas and he wasn't makpid on Aaron and Miriam? He actually prayed for Miriam. And it says, Moshe Shanav Ma'od. So why all of a sudden on Yoshua? So seems to be makpid. But nearly. So now Reb Yaakov comes up with his sod, and I have to tell you, every gadol that I knew had a medrash that was his medrash. He basically beat it to death. Okay? Rav Soloveitchik had a medrash like that. I'll never forget it. His medrash was the Masechta Nida about the child. You teach all the Torah before the child is born, and then the child forgets, right, because of the malach. And Rav Soloveitchik goes through this medrash 20 different ways in 20 different places. And by the way, he shows there's halachic ramifications of the medrash, because that's a brisker. There has to be halachic ramifications of a medrash, not just a musar haskel, right? And Rav Soloveitchik tries to show that. Reb Yaakov, as a Litvak, does the same thing. He has a medrash that he beats to death. I remember Rav Hutner had one. I don't remember what it was, but he also had a medrash. So all the Gedolei Torah that I knew always had certain medrashim that they said over and over again. So a lot of times I heard this medrash from Reb Yaakov. It's a one-liner by a hesped. You'll soon see why. Hespedim, he used to say it. But nearly, the Hadam Hatzinu B'Harbe Mekomis B'Chazal, Im Arishonu Kamalachim, Anu K'Bnei Adam. Now, the Medrash continues on. It says, Im Arishonu K'Bnei Adam, Anu K'Chamora. Right? If the first ones are like angels, we're like men. If first ones are like men, we're like donkeys. Zeu Eina Mamar Agadi. This is not just a Agadic Medrash. Okay, here's the Litvak, Bilvad. El Yisodu Musad Ba'alacha. This is a Yisod in Halacha, this one line, Imarishon Kamalachim Anu K'Bnei Adam. How? Dine, Imam Rabba, Ez Halacha, Barav Yosef, Ve'esve Mi Braisa. Rabba says a certain halacha, and Reb Yosef, who was the bar plukta of Rabba, brings a Braisa with a question. Vimlo Matzo Kimta, O Yishuv Acher, Amaylo Yomar Ani Cholak Ala Braisa. Why can't Rabba say, okay, I disagree with a Braisa, big deal, right? He couldn't find an ukimta. The Gemara always tries to make an ukimta, right? Right? Why can't he just say, I argue? Rav Shabo Omrim, Rav Tanu Polik. In a number of places it says that Rav is a Tanu Upolik. He's allowed to argue with Tanoim, even though he's sort of an Amora, but he's sort of like a Tana also. He's got like, he sort of was in both Tkufot, right? Tkufas Tanoim, Tkufas Amoroim. Avlafilu Rabbi Yochanan. The Kaimlan Rav Reb Yochanan halacha Reb Yochanan. The Gemara in Beitza says that if there's a machlokas Rav and Reb Yochanan, the halacha is Reb Yochanan. Afilu hachi kosav atosvis the perakama the ksuvis the Reb Yochanan amoru ve'elo koach lachlok ala brisa. Reb Yochanan is an amora. Even though Rav Reb Yochanan halacha Reb Yochanan, I remember the way Reb Yaakov said it to me. He said Rav Reb Yochanan halacha Reb Yochanan zet mindach. We see that Reb Yochanan was a bigger lamdan than Rav. Yet Rav is a Tana Upolik. He's a Tana. He has the halacha of a Tana, and he could argue on a brisa. And Reb Yochanan, if you bring a brisa, it's tiyufta the Reb Yochanan tiyufta, right? Val korchach dezel banui ala yesod shel marishanim kamalachim anu k'bnei adam. He says this whole yesod that a Tana and a Mora can't argue on a Tana. The yesod comes from this concept, right? Reb Yaakov seems to have said, and I got this impression from him, that it's not just a decision that we made not to argue one generation, one kufa, not a generation, but one period on the other period. It wasn't just a kufa question that, new kufa, so we don't argue on the old kufa. By the way, if I'm not mistaken, the Kesef Mishnah, I think Rabbi Yosef brings it also, Kesef Mishnah in Hilchos Maimrim does say that it could very well be that we just decided it'd be neater. It'll be neater if we don't argue on the previous generation. Rabbi Yaakov holds you can't argue in the previous generation. Right? So he builds this whole concept of Kufas and halacha from this chazal, which again, that's obviously halachically, but not just agaric. We would normally learn this chazal is that the people were so much greater than us and they bigger bali musar or greater human beings or something. He doesn't really go so much into that. He goes much more into the idea of halachically they were so much greater, and in the new generation or new period, they weren't as great anymore. By the way, this is a medrash that the Alter of Slobodka also used to mention. Well, he didn't mention in terms of halacha, and I'm not going to go into how he understood it, but if you want to look in the Truas HaMusar, volume 3, I think he does explain over there how he understood it. El Shaddai, page Lamed Vav. El Shaddai and Tzarech Bir. Mihu shehechlit shetkufa zu hi min harishonim umikavel chaschilu ha'amoroyim. Who decided? Who decides that this tkufa is from the Rishonim, meaning from the previous? It should really be a Tanoim, but I don't have the letter in front of me. Reb Yosef has the letter, but I don't have the letter in front of me. I can't get a hold of the sefer. Somehow or another, it didn't make it to my new house. And I don't have the sefer, so I couldn't look it up. But I think in the letter, Reb Yaakov writes, based on Im Rishonim Kamalachim, that language he used over here. Shetkufa zu hi min harishonim mekam ve'elach yaschilu amaroyim. Who decides when one tkufa ends and another tkufa begins? V'chein tkufas amaroyim miu zeh shehichlit she'ad hashta hayu amaroyim. Right? Who decides? Who decides that? V'chein ha'gaonim v'chein avar rishonim. How do they all decide that this is the end of Tkufas Agonim, beginning of the Rishonim? And the nafkamina, of course, is that you can't argue for one generation one Tkufa can't argue on the other Tkufa. Vanira, Shagodol Shaba'oso Tkufa, the great one in this Tkufa, who we know Hamachlit, the greatest person in that generation, whatever generation is the end of the Tkufa, he's the one who decides. Ulefikach, Mikivich Rabbeinu HaKadosh Siddur HaMishnah, V'chiber Chibur, Shenichlal Bo Kol HaTorah Shebal Peh, and he made a Chibur called the Mishnah, which includes all of Torah Shebal Peh, meaning all the Torah oral law from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu till his day, right? Which has both things from Sinai, post-Sinai, the Rices, the Rabbanans, whatever it is, but he gathered together all that, created a Seder, and Shenichal Bo Kol HaTorah Shebal Peh, Hare hochiach shedaito hi shemeata kol adoros habam lo yiyu rak before she'Torah shebal peh. That all the generations from now on will be explaining the Torah shebal peh. What they won't be doing anymore. So normally we say they won't be arguing on the previous generation, just explaining the previous generation. But Rabbi Yaakov means something more over here. And Rabbi Yaakov, I think, says it in other places as well. And other people say it too, that not only can a Mora not argue on a Tana, but even more so, and a Mora can darshan a pasuk lahalacha. In other words, the Tanoim drash psukim al piyugim midos. But you don't find that with the Amoraim. You almost don't find them they drash a pasuk for Musar. And I got it pasuk and drashing all over the place. But not halachic. Not halachic, when the Shlosheh say Mida Shator in the dress, you don't find that the Amoraim are doing that. And even if you find it a little bit, it gets less and less until it's no more. So, in other words, not only could the new Tkufa not argue on the old Tkufa, the only right they had was to explain the old Tkufa, but they couldn't even use the method that the old Tkufa used. Rak mafarshei HaTorah shebal peh ubi yeshivaso higdir she'ad shuras rav hinam tanoim. And until in his yeshiva, Rebbe Yehuda Nasi, in his yeshiva, he decided, or he defined, that until Shuras Rav, because Rav was a Talmud of Rebbe Yehuda Nasi, so he decided that the row that Rav sat in the base medrash, Hinam Tanoim, they're still Tanoim, right? Reb Yaakov didn't say this, but my impression is that there are certain people who are shaykh to both Kufos. There's sort of what we call the bridge between two Kufos, but we'll talk about this at a different point. Reb Yaakov will speak a little bit more about it, but the way I'm understanding it is that Rav was a Tanu Polit, but he was also shaykh to the Amoraim as well, because obviously Rabbi Yochanan, if he was really a Tana, Rabbi Yochanan couldn't argue on him, right? And so Rabbi Yochanan is always arguing on Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, right? So obviously he was not exactly a Tana. It's just he had a certain power of Tanoim. So I say that's sort of like a bridge between the two Kufos. And we'll talk about other people who were bridges between the two Kufos. Rabbi Yochanan Shayib Yeshivas Rebbe Ela Shahaya Yoshev Yudzai and Shuras Acharei Shuras Rav. He sat 17 rows after the row of Rav. I'm reading Bechulin. Unishar ben Amoraim. He remained amongst Amoraim because he was 17 rows behind. And after the row of Rav, right? So in other words, Rav was either older than him or a student that was older in the Shir than Rabbi Yochanan, right? And therefore he was still allowed to break through that barrier of the new Tkufa, or the old Tkufa, I should say, of Tanoim, whereas Rabbi Yochanan sat further back and he was not allowed to already do that, which is, by the way, interesting, because Rav Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, right? So you see, Rabbi Yochanan was a big alamdin, but arguing on a Tana, he didn't have that schus, which is a very interesting idea if you think about it. I remember once sitting with Reb Yaakov and asking him, I never saw any of your smichas. I said, Zaidi, I never saw any of your smichas. So he says, what? You think I don't have smicha? So I said, no, I know you have, but I don't know what they are. So he says, I got smicha for Moshe Mordechai Epstein. I got smicha from the Kovner Rav, and the Dvar Avram, the Kovner Rav, and I got smicha from Mrs. Zalman Meltzer. And then I got smicha from someone who I later became a bigger lamdin than him. He didn't say I later Mustama, I became a bigger lamdin than him. So I asked him who it was, and he said Reb Shmuel Fundeler. Okay, now Shmuel Fundeler was the Rav in my father's city. Shmuel Fundeler, the Rav of Ritava, right? So Reb Yaakov chapped that he had said that he became a bigger lamdin than my father's rabbi from Ritava, and he felt bad saying it. So he said to me, he was a princely person. There was no one as princely as he was. That's what he felt like bad that I'm going to think how dare you say you're bigger than my father's rabbi? I had no problem with him saying it, but he felt bad. So sometimes you get smicha from somebody because he's a generation earlier, but later you become a bigger lamdin. So that could also be with Rabbi Yochanan. He was sitting back there, but eventually became maybe a bigger lamdin than Rav. But he didn't have the schus that Rav had. No, what we're really saying is that being over there doesn't just give you like an automatic schus. It means you're from another generation, even if you're not as big a lamdin. That being from a different generation doesn't just, it means you're a different person. It's not just giving you a schus. It's not a technical thing, right? It's you're a different type of person with regard to the tkufos. So he says like this on the next page, Lamed Zayin, v'chein also Shmuel Hanavi, and also Shmuel Hanavi did the following: b'shaito acharei himlich eshol. What did Shmuel Hanavi do after he was mamlech? He made Shol melech. Ki ad also tkufa haya shofet gambal mehamasora. Because in this till this time of Shol becoming king, the Navi, there was no Navi, there was the Shofet, and the Shofet had both tafkidim. He was a military leader, and he was part of the Masorah, meaning Moshe Kibbutz Torah Misinai, Masorah Yeshua, Yeshua Liskenim. The Skenim, if you take a look, Rashi certainly learns this way, but others as well, that the Skenim are the Shoftim, but they didn't call them Shoftim, call them Skenim, because the Shofet had the connotation of a military leader. So they called them Skenim because when we talk about Pirkei Avos, we talk about Moshe Kibbutz Torah Misinai, so we're not talking about military leaders, we're talking about the other half, because they were both. The Shoftim had both sides. I'm not going to go into now, is it possible that Shimshon was part of the Masorah? Is it possible that Yiftach was part of the Masorah? Right, that's already a very good question. But from many of the Rishonim, you see the Machzer Vitri, who was a Talmud of Rashi, counts the Shoftim one after the other as being part of the Masorah. By the way, I think he even counts Dvorah as being part of the Masorah as well. Okay? Al-Metchilas Tkufas HaMelucha Shanhogas Ha'uma Tia Al Yedei Yerusha V'lo Al Yedei Gadlus Ha'ishit. But from the time of the beginning of the kingdom, how is kingdom going to go? Kingdom is going to go with Yerusha, one son from the other, and not because of the godless, the greatness of the human being. Whereas the Tkufas HaShoftim, God picked the Shofet, right? But here, once God picks the Melech, the next Melech and the next Melech is all inheritance. So since you can't have since you can't decide who the Melech is going to be according to how much of a Talmud Chacham he is, right? It goes in Yerusha. So now it had to split. The political side, the military and political side, was the king, and now became the Nevi'im, right? May Yoshua L'Skenim, Zgenim, the Shoftim, L'Nevi'im, right? The Melech no longer was part of the Masorah necessarily. It was the Nevi'im. Now, a Melech could be a Navi and be part of the Masorah, but it had to be a Navi, right? Why you had to be a Navi in itself is a good question, because we don't paskin from Nevuah, but we're not going to go into that right now. But the point over here is that Reb Yaakov says at this point it really split up, and the first Navi is Shmuel. The last Shofet is Shmuel. Okay, it says Vayishpon es Yisrael Kol Yemei Chayav. He was the last Shofet and the first Navi. Here again, you have your bridge. He was the last Shofet and the first Navi, right? V'chiber Sefer Shoftim. And what did he do? Yoshua was Mechaber Sefer Yoshua, end of a Tkufa. That Tkufa was called Tkufas Moshe, Tkufas Yoshua. Moshe wrote the Torah, that's Tkufas Moshe. Yoshua wrote Sefer Yoshua. Chiber Sefer and Shmuel was Mechaber Sefer Shoftim. V'achar kach Malachi chasam hanevuah. Then Malachi was the last Navi, right? He ended the Nevi'im. Chagai Schar Malachi, Nevi'im Achronim, and they ended. V'cheni Chasibus Hashas, and the same thing Tzchim Hashas. In other words, Reb Yaakov is trying to show that the idea of ending Tkufas by writing and gathering together a work of halacha, that didn't start Reb Yehuda Hanasi. that started, they already wrote Svarim, even though they were not exactly halachic Svarim, right? Sefer Shoftim is not necessarily a halachic sefer, and Sefer Yeshua is not necessarily a halachic sefer, even though they do have some halachas in them, right? But Reb Yaakov is saying over here that a sefer ends at Tkufa. That's how you end the Tkufa, and that's why Shmuel wrote Sefer Shoftim, and Yeshua wrote his sefer to end the Tkufa, okay? And the nafkamina, again, is, can someone argue on Yeshua, in the Sefer, in Tkufa Shoftim? Ulefika, ilmole haya Yeshua ona al shelas Moshe, sha'al mimeni kol sveka sheyesh lecha. If Yeshua would have answered Moshe's question, ask me all the things before I pass away, before I go to Gan Eden, ask me your questions. If he would have answered Moshe, I am your student and I learned from you, right? Tell me what you want to tell me, in other words. It's a very interesting Gemara, and how Reb Yaakov learns it is very interesting. And if you want to know even more, in the Hebrew edition of the Art Scroll, on the bottom, there's already the word of Reb Yaakov on that Gemara. In the English edition, it does not appear, but in the Hebrew edition, it does. Moshe Rabbeinu Shalom Omelo, Dai ki im harishonim kamalachim, ha'achronim k'bnei Adam. Moshe Rabbeinu would have answered him, what I didn't teach you yet was, I'm about to die, im harishonim kamalachim, atak ben Adam. Your tkufa is going to be less than my tkufa. Sharei mi divrei HaKadosh Baruch Hu she'omel lecha. What did God say to Yeshua according to the Medrash? I can't tell you. What does that mean? The laws of Pesach Sheni, how did they come about? Because people were Tomei Meis, right? So he said, if you're Tomei Meis, you can't bring the Pesach. So Moshe, what did Moshe say? Amalahem. He said to the people of Tomei, Imdu veshma ma yitzava lecha Hashem, right? Stand and I'll tell you what God tells me. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu goes to ask God about Pesach Sheni. So Yeshua thought he'll ask God also about the 300 halachas he forgot. So what did God say according to the Medrash? Lo melacha yefsher. I can't tell you. Tkufas Moshe's over. Moshe was able to go back to God and ask God for new Torah. You can't do that anymore. You have to now bring back the Torah through pilpul or through other means. You gimel midot. Okay, Yasa Gamu. He thought that he's going to also do that. Umeachar. Sh'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo melacha efsher. When God said to you, Kishem shasiti Moshe Rabach efsher, I can't do that to you. God said to him, I can't tell you. Then Yoshua understood that he's a different kufa. He's not on the same level of Moshe as far as Torah is concerned. He's one level below. Moshe would have given this klal. The Medrash is saying, since he said, I know everything, no de lozalia deo uvda, then he got to know it through experience, because what you don't learn through your teacher, you learn through experience, right? So that's the way Reb Yaakov is understanding this Medrash. Now, I'm not only telling you just to see how Reb Yaakov learns up this Medrash, which is interesting, and that is basically for Reb Yaakov, one of his yesodot, if not his biggest yesod, very much his biggest yesod, and how he looked at Mesiras HaTorah. But I'm going to show you in another place where Reb Yaakov answers this, uses this idea to answer a pasuk in Tanach. But that we'll already see next week or the week after. There's two other places, at least, that Reb Yaakov talks about this. One at the beginning of Sefer Shmuel, on the first Rashi in Sefer Shmuel, and then in chapter Tes in Sefer Shmuel, he also talks about it. And there we're going to see a very interesting way how Reb Yaakov learns up a parsha in Tanach that nobody before him ever learned up. And when he told it to me, I said, I can't believe it. We have Sefer Shmuel for thousands of years, and nobody ever said this pshat. I checked, I couldn't find it anywhere. So we'll talk about that Bezrat Hashem next week. So
Rav Shurin,
Yes.
in the Sefer the Dynamics of Dispute.
Yes.
Okay, so he brings out what happened between the Amoraim and the Tanaim is that the Tanaim were the last generation of the Tanaim was the last generation that knew what came from Har Sinai.
Was the last generation that what?
No, that had a Masorah, a reliable Masorah for what of the Torah Shabbat pair that they knew had come from Har Sinai.
Right. Which is a nice shot, because what he's basically saying is you can't argue on the Tanaim because maybe it comes from Sinai. Is that what he's saying?
Correct.
I remember you loved that Sefer.
Correct.
I don't remember who wrote it. I remember you had it at Yeshiva, and I don't remember who wrote it. Who wrote it?
I have it here.
Shimel.
Oh, Shimel. Yeah. Yes. I think
Rabbi Tzvi Lampel.
Oh, Lampel. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So yes, it's an excellent idea. Reb Yaakov doesn't go with that approach. It seems Reb Yaakov, does he explain this medrash as well?
I haven't Sefer for since I was in Reb Yaakov.
So I'll tell you, the reason why Reb Yaakov probably liked his approach is because this approach works for Yoshua too. Because according to the Sefer, what was it called? Dynamic of the
Dynamics of Dispute.
So that's the Tkufa of Tanoim and Amoraim, but L'chora, Yoshua, and Shoftim, they should be able to argue because they know what came from Sinai and what didn't come from Sinai, right? So Yaakov already wants to tell you that even in the Tkufa of Yoshua, there was a Yeridas Hadoros, and that he's not Moshe Rabbeinu anymore, even though he never moved from the tent. So he sort of knew everything, but one halacha he didn't know. He didn't know that. By the way, I have to tell you that I remember I was still in America at the time. I don't know if you guys know that there was a period when the hospitals, the doctors used to do netuche mesim on people that passed away without asking the family. And then someone discovered it because they didn't put back the bodies so well together. So when the Chevra Kadisha had to do the Tara, they began to notice that there's a problem here. So the Netuche Mesa became a very big deal in Israel because they didn't ask the families. Today, you're also allowed to do Netuche Mesa, secular people, if they want to give their bodies for science. But today we ask them to sign something. We ask the family, right? In those days, they try to get away with it, and they couldn't get away with it. So Rabbi Yaakov, I'll never forget, he spoke by the rally against the Netuche Mesa. And Reb Yaakov started off and said like this: by us, the Rishonim are like Malachim. And you don't argue on a Malach, so we're like Bnei Adam. But by the secular world, Anu Bnei Adam, right? The Rishonim are Bnei Adam, they're just human beings. So the later ones are like Chamorim. And a Chamor is certainly allowed to do Netuche Mesim on. That's to just show you how Reb Yaakov beat this medrash to death, right? He used it everywhere, okay? So I heard it from him in many, many different areas. He used it in many different types, many different places, okay? So it was definitely a tremendous yisod, and that's the way he understood the makar. If you ask Reb Yaakov, the makar for tkufos, meaning our makar for tkufos is Moshe Kibbel Torah Messina, Masarul Yeshua, Shul Skanim. That's a Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, right? That's how we see this Tkufos, right? Because we always assume that why would Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi give us this idea of Tkufos if it's not so meaningful, right? Could he just be saying it just to say that, all this that we're going to be learning here comes from Sinai? So he should just say, call me Sinai. What does he start with these tkufos? So Rabbi Yaakov understands that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is giving us really mamish tkufos that are nogeil to halacha. And where does that halacha come from? It comes from Rishon Kamalacha Manu Bnei Adam. That yisod. Where does that yisod come from? Rabbi Yaakov never found it, so to speak, or I shouldn't say didn't find. He never spoke about where it comes from in the Torah. But we're going to see. We're going to see in the Nevi'im, Reb Yaakov tries to show that he has a pasuk that clearly says it in the Nevi'im. Any other questions, guys? Yeah, question, Max.
What do you attribute this idea to, that Reb Yaakov or other Gedolim had a specific medrash like that they used so frequently, that they focused so much on? Like, why only such a focused mimer?
I think it basically had to do with their experience in Torah and their personalities. I think, they came up with this because of experience. I don't think they found a source that everybody has to have their medrash, even though maybe there is I don't know if there maybe is a makar like that everybody has to have their medrash. I seem to remember, I have to try to remind myself, I seem to remember there is such a idea that everybody has to have their medrash. I think Rav Soloveitchik even spoke about it when he spoke about his medrash. He spoke about saying that Gedolim he knew always had their medrash, right? And this is my medrash, he said. I think he even said that. But the question is, where does that idea come from? I don't remember if there's like a makar that they had in the Gemara that had such a thing. I'll check to see, but I don't remember such a thing. But I think it came simply because for them, that was the big yisod. By the way, that's the way Reb Yaakov learned up Pirkei Avos. I want to give you a chiddush here. Reb Yaakov claimed that every Tana in Pirkei Avos, right, whatever he said there was something about the yisod of his life. In other words, these were the yisodis, the way they lived their life. It wasn't just a mamar. I could actually show you Reb Yaakov says this, right? He says, it's not just that each person thought of a nice idea, right? No. This is what his whole Torah was based on. This was whole his Yahadus was based on. So if you see somebody saying, something like, something like, having me Talmid of Shal Aaron, if Shalom, Merodah Shalom, if Hillel says that was the Yesod Musad of his life. That's the way he lived his life, which we do actually see that he lived his life as Ves Habrius Makarvan La Torah, right? We see from the Gemara in Shabbos. So that's the way Reb Yaakov understood it. But is there a makar for it in Chazal? I don't know if that. I have to just check that.
In Pirkei Avos, the Hu Haya Omer sounds like that.
It's that you're right. That lashon is Hu Haya Omer. He would say. So it doesn't sound like he said, but he would say, right? So it sounds like he said it a lot, like Reb Yaakov. He said it a lot, all the time, right? Any other questions? Yeah.
Maybe the Rav mentioned this and I just missed it, but Shoftim to Nevi'im looks like an aliyah, not a yurida.
It looks like a
aliyah, not a yurida.
That's what it actually looks like, correct? And right. I said to you, I actually I didn't speak about it. I just mentioned that it's not so simple to say, right? I wouldn't normally have said that, Shimshon is part of the Masorah, but I certainly would say, that the Gemara does say, Jonathan, the Gemara, I think it's in Tainus, where it says, is it in Tainus? I don't remember. Maybe it's in Rosh Hashanah. I think it's Rosh Hashanah.
Somebody in his generation and is
Yiftach B'Doro Kishmuel B'Doro.
Right, yeah.
Right? So we normally understand that as meaning that even though Yiftach wasn't as great as Shmuel, but he was Yiftach B'Doro Kishmuel B'Doro, right? So it's probably a lot of ways to learn that. Maybe Reb Yaakov would learn that as with regard to the Masorah, he had a greater Masorah than Shmuel, or a higher level Masorah. Don't forget, the Tkufas HaShoftim was still military leaders that, according to Chazal, were also Torah leaders. Okay, so having both of those shows how great you could be, because in the time of Shaul, when the leadership is split up, meaning you have now a Torah leader and you have a military leader, so one person couldn't have both, right? One person couldn't have both. So one person could be a military leader and a Torah leader. That was a very high level that they didn't have already in Tkufas Malachim. By the way, I have to tell you that Reb Yaakov does mention a technical reason why. He says because the Melech was Morish, his Malchus, to his children, and you can't pick how a child's going to be. So I want to tell you where Reb Yaakov was going with that. Reb Yaakov used to say that he was a Litvak. So he said the Rebbes, a Rebbe, and then his child becomes the Rebbe, and then his child becomes the Rebbe. He says in Lithuania, it wasn't like that. The children didn't become the head of the yeshivas. Who became the head of the yeshivas? The sons-in-law, right? And he went off listing all the different sons-in-law of all the different yeshivas. But the children didn't. You know what he said? Because a child, he can't pick. A son-in-law, you can't pick, right? So a child, he can't know if he's going to be a big Rosh Yeshiva or not. But the what do you call it? I see my camera's a little bit funny. But the child, you can't pick if he's going to be a big Rosh Yeshiva. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But the son-in-law, you do pick. And also, they didn't want to establish their children in they didn't want to establish. Oh, that's better, I think. They didn't want to establish didn't want to make their children Rosh Yeshivas because it looked like you're Nageya B'davar, right? Why are you taking your son? Who says he's the biggest one? But today, I don't think they care about that anymore. They take not any problem anymore, right?
Installing a son-in-law doesn't look like a Negea.
What?
Installing a son-in-law doesn't look like a Negea.
Yeah, he's Nageya, but at least he's a very big lamdan because he picked them. Today, I guess you can't really pick sons-in-law so easily anymore because, now you can't just decide this guy's going to be my son-in-law, right? Because it doesn't always work so well. The shidduch doesn't work so well if you're not careful. But in those days, it worked very well. So Reb Yaakov said they did that, right? But in the tkufas of the Malachim, you had to have the Navi, which, by the way, every Melech had a Navi. Reb Yaakov's going to talk about this. We'll see. Shaul had Shmuel. David had Nasa. Shlomo had Achia Shiloni. Each one of these Malachim always had a counterpart who was in charge of the Torah, right? So even though Jonathan is right, we have a Navi, it sounds like that's the most chashuv, because how could you be greater than Navi? But by the way, we know that Nevuah can't decide on Torah, right? A person could be a great Navi, but another person could be a bigger lamdan than that person, even though, of course, he has to know Torah, especially if he's part of the Masorah, then he obviously has to know Torah. But you can have a person who's a bigger lamdan than the Navi, right? And yet the Navi got Nevuah. And, my grandfather used to say about the Chofetz Chaim and Reb Chaim Briska. It's very controversial what he said, but he said it to me. He said to me, if someone would tell me that the Chofetz Chaim didn't have Ruach HaKodesh, obviously nobody has Nevuah today, but didn't have Ruach HaKodesh, I would argue with him. I feel the Chofetz Chaim had Ruach HaKodesh, and I could prove it to you, he said, from his Mishnah Brura. Okay, he didn't say how, but he could prove from the Mishnah Brura. But he said, if someone would tell me Reb Chaim Briska didn't have Ruach HaKodesh, I'd be very comfortable with it. Now, Reb Chaim was definitely a bigger lamdan than the Chofetz Chaim. There's no two ways about it, because Reb Chaim was probably the biggest lamdan in his whole generation, hands down. Okay, but Reb Yaakov meant to say, not that he wasn't a great personality, he was a great tzaddik also. There's no question about it. If you read about what they write about Reb Chaim, you could know he was great in Hasidus and a great tzaddik too. But he wasn't that type to get Ruach HaKodesh. He was the type to learn through everything, as a lamdan, Chofetz Chaim was a holy person, and Reb Chaim didn't view himself as the holy person, so to speak. So you have this contrast many times where a guy could be a bigger lamdan, but he's not necessarily, he can't read your forehead, right? And then sometimes the guy, the Baal Kabbalah could read your forehead like the Arizal, but there are people maybe bigger Talmidei Chacham than him, maybe not bigger Kabbalists, bigger Talmidei Chacham than him, that you could have. Okay, guys, we'll stop here. We'll take it up next week. Hashem.